What's up, guys, and welcome back to Moan Inc. If you guys are new here, then hello. My name is Erica, and it is a pleasure to have you joining me today on the channel. Because for today's video, as you can see from the title, I am chatting to expert and archaeologist Duncan Mackay about his incredible new book titled Echolands, A Journey in Search of Boudica. Now, you guys have been requesting Boudica for the longest time. So when I saw this book come out, I immediately ran to the shop to go and pick it up, and I cannot recommend it enough. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed every single page, every single story. The way that Duncan takes you on this journey of finding Boudica by literally walking the landscapes, bringing up the archaeological evidence, bringing up the literary sources that we have that support certain things or that write differently. All of that stuff is just done on such a personal and easy to read level that I was so excited by this book. I knew that I had to invite Duncan on to have a chat about Boudica. So for you guys who, maybe throughout the video or just now want to buy the book, you guys can find that linked in the description below. So definitely check that out. But for now, Duncan, we should turn to you. And the way that I start all these episodes is actually by asking about your specific context. So I like to ask historians and archaeologists how they got into the field that they're now in, how they ended up, in your case, writing this book on Boudica, discovering Boudica, and how it led you to the life that you now lead. So what is that context that we would need to help understand the journey to this book?
I became an archaeologist back in about 1990, I think. I'd always been fascinated by history. I'd always been fascinated by Boudica. I did Boudica at school when I was about 8 years old. I thought it was one of the most interesting things we ever did in history. So when I became an archaeologist, it was something of an obsession of mine. I worked in archaeology for about 20 years, and then I left to raise my family and pursue my own research. And that resulted in me going out into the landscape with the classical texts that we have to talk about Boudica, and my knowledge of archaeology, and to explore the landscape and to see how close I could get to that story. And that resulted in me writing Echolands, A Journey in Search of Boudica.
Yeah, and when you start this book, I can't remember if it's in the introduction or literally chapter 1, you talk about this image that this drawing that you found that you had done at school, and you kind of make fun of it, and you're like, I'm allowed to, it was done by me. But it's really sweet, this story of how you first discovered Boudica and how it really excited you. But at school, because for me, we did a very small section of Boudica growing up, and then we moved on and we never addressed it again. And then now everybody's asking me about Boudica. So at school, was it something that you were constantly exposed to, or was it just because you had done it when you were young that really intrigued you and that kind of stayed with you?
Very much the latter. I don't think we ever touched on her again, to be honest. I think it was very much that one little incident when I was about 8 years old. We had the Ladybird Book of Roman Britain. There's a fantastic picture of her in that, several pictures in there relating to Boudica's war, and that really stuck with me. But no, after that, it was just me tracking down the story. We never did it again, so there were no other influences there.
That's really interesting that it's something that just really stuck with you, that then you ended up wanting to write this whole book, and you've appeared on so many podcasts. Like, I find that really sweet and really endearing.
Yeah, it was one of those things that really got under my skin. As I said in the book, I didn't get a very good mark for my picture of Boadicea, as we called her then, but it's definitely stuck with me. Absolutely got under my skin. Yeah.
So when it comes to Boudica, you said the literary sources that we have available. What are those for people who are listening that don't know sort of what the literature specifically that we're dealing with about Boudica is?
We are absolutely blessed in this particular instance. I think when people think about Roman Britain, they think that we know it. It's the historical period. We have all this information. We can talk endlessly about it. We actually have relatively few historical sources for Roman Britain. And by far the most that we have are for the early period, for that conquest period. So the Romans came in AD 43. And they continued to work their way across Britain, conquering until AD 83, when they got up into Scotland and smashed the Caledonians at a battle called Mons Graupius. That period is the best covered. beyond that, we just have fragments and mentions and a few more details, but it's much more scrappy. So for that period, we have 2 by Tacitus, which is a real blessing because Tacitus is a really great Roman historian, and it's also covered by Cassius Dio, who was writing about a century after Tacitus. Who, again, it's very useful. Not quite so historically accurate, we think. But yeah, we have 3 Roman texts. So the first one was by Tacitus, which was his autobiography, his biography of his father-in-law Agricola. Now, Agricola came to Britain in AD 60 or perhaps a little bit before and was involved in Boudica's war. So Tacitus had a personal connection to this. His biography of Agricola is very weak in that early period because Agricola was only a junior officer. He didn't have a major role in that war. When he goes on to talk about the later conquest of Britain, when Agricola was a legionary commander and then the governor, he goes into much more detail. Fortunately, Tacitus, then when he writes his enormous, sweeping, great history of Rome called the Annals, he tackles Boudica again, and there he really gives us a very detailed account. He's clearly gone back and researched it. He's checking his sources. He gives us a very detailed account that fits very well with what we know of the geography of Roman Britain, the troop dispositions, the road network. And some of his descriptions are really quite captivating when you know he's talking about a particular piece of landscape. Then we have Dio Cassius, and he's writing about a century after Tacitus. He gives us the main account of AD 43, the year the Romans invaded, and that's a very good account. It's very useful. His account of Boudica's war, unfortunately, like me, he really loves the subject. But for Dio Cassius, that means that he embellishes it. He gives these enormous speeches to people like Boudicca and the general Suetonius Paulinus. He gives this huge battle scene, which he's really sucking out of his thumb, I think. And so the details that he gives us are much less. But yeah, we have 3 accounts. It's probably the best described event in Roman Britain. So it's a great thing to work from.
Well, you mentioned these speeches that Boudica and other characters have been given in Dio. And the other week, was it last week or the week before? Time is all coming together for me, who knows? But very recently, I spoke to Dr. Emma Southern, who wrote her new book about 21 women who helped shape the Roman Empire. And we briefly touched on Boudica, and she said, because I haven't read Dio, so she said, oh, there's this wacky speech in there about taxes and about how Boudica is really focusing on taxes and all of this. So she kind of went into that. And I was just wondering from your perspective, like, why do we think that Dio is more so embellishing these stories and writing in all of these speeches that don't seem to make any sense? Like, is it for his audience? Is it for future generations? Is it because he doesn't know the story necessarily himself, and so he wants to make it longer? Like, what's the purpose behind it?
It's a very interesting question, actually. And that speech particularly that he puts into Boudicca's mouth it's full of quite contemporary political rhetoric, so very much for his audience. He talks about things that Boudicca couldn't possibly have known or certainly wouldn't have known. It's a criticism of Rome at that period, of these effete, weak Romans who are addicted to luxury, as opposed to the hard, tough Britons who live this quite Spartan existence. He's having a pop at a lot of things, but it's very much for his audience, and I think he's just enjoying himself. He's writing and he's putting all of these things in. But you're right, the taxation thing is quite interesting because that's not really something that Tacitus talks about. Tacitus talks about the inspiration of the rebellion in other terms, whereas Cassius Dio does mention this this thing about extortion, of loans being given to the Britons and called back in again, of gifts of money being given to the Britons and then being taken back quite harshly, and then tax. Boudicca's speech, and that she talks about how even the dead are taxed by the Romans. Even the dead aren't safe from being taxed by them, and it's very much for his audience. I think what Dio does constantly in his account, he warms to his account, and so he as a writer, he really gets into that flow, and he can't really stop himself. But yeah, the money aspect, the taxation aspect is quite interesting because that's something we don't get from Tacitus. So it is important that we take all three into account and combine them where we can. Yeah.
So those are the literary sources that we have on Boudica. As an archaeologist, what do we have on the ground from this period?
This is another very lucky thing, and that it's one of those instances where you have this graphic historical account, but you can actually see it in the soil and follow the event in the landscape. As archaeologists, we do tend to avoid trying to link what we dig to the historic record and let it speak for itself. When you have a historical pigeonhole to shove things into, that can be quite dangerous because you rather than just saying, well, we found this destruction there in this city. It could be a normal fire. It could have been somebody's house burning down, started it all off. But because we have Boudicca, we say, well, obviously this was burnt by Boudicca. Tacitus tells us that 3 cities were destroyed by Boudicca: Colchester, London, St Albans, Camulodunum, Londinium, Verulamium. When you dig down to the correct layer in those cities, you find this red layer of burnt daub and ash, complete destruction. All 3 were clearly flattened. The archaeology in those is really incredible, and it gives you some very intimate stories that you don't get from the histories. You can dig down into individual houses and see what was actually there the day that the house burned. You can begin to wonder what happened to the people whose possessions you're digging up. It's remarkable archaeology. You also have a few fires elsewhere in the country at about that time, to within a decade or 2 of that time. We can't date them precisely, but they're not mentioned by Tacitus. So then the great question is, are these related to Boudica, or are they just another fire that happened 10 years later or whatever? So it can be very difficult to pinpoint. One of the great things is Tacitus often describes landscape. So even places where you don't have any archaeology, you can go and read Tacitus knowing that you're staring at the same site that he's describing. Now, he wasn't here. We don't think Tacitus ever came to Britain. It is possible, but he certainly wasn't here during that time. But he starts his account of Boudicca's rebellion off with the Roman army being in North Wales. And they're conquering an island off the north coast of Wales called Anglesey. The landscape that he describes is spot on. And he describes the Romans making a fleet of flat-bottomed boats to get across the shifting shallows to the island. And when you go to the Menai Strait and look across to Anglesey, that's exactly the landscape he's talking about. So it's a combination of the archaeology and the landscape, I suppose, the modern landscape in physical terms. But yes, there's some fantastic archaeology that we have no doubt at all relates to it.
So then we have to come to the big question, which is, what is leading up to Boudicca's rebellion? Like, what's the catalyst that happens for people who are listening who goes, that's all great, but what is it that pushed Boudicca over the edge to actually start this rebellion?
It was a little long-standing, but when the Romans invaded in AD 43, they very quickly overcame the resistance in the southeast of Britain. Then they conquered the southwest and moved up into the Midlands. The tribes that were beaten would have suffered terribly. The Romans, really would slaughter. They would take the spoils of war. They would take lots of slaves. And if you were a conquered people, they wouldn't necessarily treat you very well. A lot of tribes didn't fight. You didn't go up against the Romans without good reason because of all of that. So a lot of the tribes, like Boudica's tribe, the Iceni or the Iceni, but probably the Iceni, they made peace with the Romans. They didn't fight initially. They became what we call a client state. And that means that they ruled with Roman approval. The monarch, in this case, a king called Prasutagus, could stay in power and have a nominal independence. They wouldn't be occupied. They wouldn't have an army of occupation within them. They probably wouldn't have slaves taken from them, but they would have to pay their taxes. They would probably have to give a levy of young men for the auxiliary regiments. And they would have to do exactly what the Romans wanted. I would say it's a bit like a protection racket. They the Romans would leave them alone and even protect them if necessary, but at a very high price. And ultimately, when that monarch died, they would be absorbed into the province.
Is that quickly the same as, is it Cartimandua?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
very much so. Yeah, so at the same time, probably the Brigantes in the north of Britain were under a queen called Cartimandua, and she was a client monarch. So she was in a very similar situation, whereas with Boudica, it was Boudicca's husband, Prasutagus, was the monarch, and she was the consort, seemingly. In the north of Britain, it was Cartimandua, and her husband Venutius was the consort. But yes, and it's very interesting, the comparison there, actually, when you mentioned Cartimandua, because the Brigantes were split between pro and anti-Roman factions. So although Cartimandua was this pro-Roman monarch who did her best to keep in with the Romans and to not get involved in any fights with them, her husband was quite anti-Roman, and there was a lot of trouble because of that, and eventually they split up. She was ousted, and there was a war with the Romans. We don't know about the situation with Boudica and her husband. It seems that he was quite loyal to the Romans. There was a small rebellion in AD 47 when the Romans came to disarm the Iceni, and the Iceni rose up in rebellion. That was put down quite savagely, but Prasutagus remained king, or at least the Iceni weren't at that point absorbed. So presumably, whoever was in charge, presumably at that point, Prasutagus, hadn't taken part in it. So may even have aided the Romans in putting it down. We don't know. The Iceni were left to themselves, but the tribe to the south of them, the Trinovantes, in pretty much what is now Essex, they were a conquered tribe. They'd fought the Romans initially and been conquered. And their great settlement at Camalodunum, Colchester, was taken over by the Romans initially as a fortress, but then as what we call a colonia, to settle retiring veterans from the Roman army. Now, these veterans from the Roman army were coming from a vicious guerrilla war in Wales. I think it'd be fair to say they pretty much hated the Britons. They were used to taking what they wanted at the point of the sword, and Tacitus specifically says that they were treating the Trinovantes as slaves. They were taking them as slaves, kicking them off their farms, fleecing them of their wealth to develop this new town with big government buildings and a huge temple, the Temple of Claudius. This was all coming from the local people. So the Trinovantes were already very resentful. And in AD 60 or AD 59, sometime probably during that winter, the king of the Iceni, Prasutagus, died. He had left a will to the Emperor Nero, leaving half of his kingdom to the emperor and half to his daughters with Boudica, in the hope that this would save his people from losing everything and help them keep some power with his family, but also to ward off full annexation and perhaps keep some of the wealth. The Romans weren't having any of that. They went in to take the whole kingdom. Boudica was flogged. Her daughters were raped. And that, I think, symbolically is enormously important, because for the Iceni, remember the king, half the kingdom had been left to the daughters, not to Boudica. So by raping the daughters, symbolically, that was like destroying the kingdom in the worst possible way. It was the worst insult you could possibly inflict upon them. The Iceni rose in rebellion. The Trinovantes rose with them. And so there was this long-standing, festering situation that had probably gone on for decades, but it finally came to a head in AD 60.
This might sound really stupid, but why would the king assume that the Romans would respect the will that he wants to split it half and half if it would have been more normal for the Romans to come in and take over? Like, why did he have that confidence, or at least that inkling, or maybe they might be nice this time?
It's a really good question, and Tacitus doesn't tell us really about that. It may be that he'd had so much contact with the Romans by that time that he understood that leaving a will was the Roman thing to do, and you could try to do this. It's very interesting, though, in the Agricola, Tacitus's early work, he talks about Agricola as an old man under a bad emperor, Domitian. And he says that Agricola left half of his estate to Domitian, and half to his family, pointing out that only under a bad emperor would a good father leave half of his estate to the emperor. That has to make you wonder whether Prasutagus really did leave a will, and this really did happen, or whether Tacitus is drawing upon this knowledge of Agricola and using it as an example that the Romans would understand, that Prasutagus was a good king and a good man and a good father who was trying to protect his family from a bad emperor. But yeah, we simply don't know. It's one of those things we assume is true, and it may well be true. It might just have been a common thing with the Romans under a bad emperor. To safeguard yourself, you shove the emperor a load of cash and hope that he'll then leave your family alone. But no, we don't know.
That's really interesting, actually. Well, something else I thought was also really interesting was that Dio, or Dio, however we're choosing to say his name, but he wrote quite graphically, anyways, from what at least you write and what you've also said and what I heard from Emma about Boudica going off, and I was going to say some graphic words, but I guess we're on YouTube, so it doesn't matter anymore. But it's quite atrocious what she does to some people. There are quite some graphic details in there. How much of that can we trust? Because there are some, in my opinion, I don't really know. You could hear this and be like, no, actually, that makes total sense. Wasn't that she cut off breasts of women and sewed it to their mouth? Like some horrible things. How much of that do we think probably what Boudica did? She was mad. Like you said, she had a huge army behind her that was also supporting this and doing this as well. And how much of this do we just think is sort of mustered up to make it seem more reasonable that the Romans then went in and put a stop to her?
I think it's probably a bit of both of that. It's the problem with the specific details. I mean, Tacitus says that they didn't take prisoners and that they hung and crucified people and did terrible things. Dio goes into those specific details. He says that he specifically singles out the noblest women they're skewered lengthwise on wooden stakes, and they have their breasts cut off and sewed to their mouths to make it appear as though they're eating them. That's not something we're ever going to know. I don't think we're ever going to find archaeological evidence of that. We find very few bodies relating to the war at all, and they're usually in scraps and fragments. I don't think we need doubt that terrible, terrible atrocities took place. I mean, we just look at any war throughout history, right through to the present day. There's no doubt that an army like that would have committed the most terrible atrocities and probably didn't take prisoners. The true was same of the Romans, to be perfectly honest. The great question is whether the details related by Dio are significant in that context, a ritual context, perhaps. None of those details relate to anything else that's ever really mentioned about the Britons or the northern European peoples. It does rather read like Dio's vivid imagination, but even if it was taken perhaps from a source that he had, a military report perhaps that had made its way to the imperial archives, atrocity stories always gain color as they speed through an army. So even in relatively modern wars, I think it can be quite difficult to get to the truth of atrocity stories. So it's not something we're going to ever know, but it's one of the most enduring images of the war and the horror of that war is this idea of the women being mutilated. Yeah,
absolutely. And like you said, it's not just the Britons, it's also the Romans that do atrocities in all wars. That's just what war is. But we should go to the most important battle of this whole Boudica episode. And I just want to say as a side note, when I was telling people that I was going to chat to you, everybody asked me to ask your opinion about that final standoff between Boudica and the Romans, because everyone wants to know, where is that battlefield? And that's a lot of what this book is I love the way you write this book, of how personal it is and how you're just going on this walk and then you bring up all these memories and you relate it to what you're looking at. I thought it was so enjoyable, but that is a very big part of the book, is going to this battle scene to figure out, not necessarily 100%, but at least what you think this is. So can you explain this final standoff and what at least you think that battlefield is and why?
Yeah, but the working out where the armies go and relating those to each other is part of the great mystery, the great frustration, but also the great fun of the story. So we know Boudica destroys Colchester. She then marches to London, but the Romans and Suetonius Paulinus, coming from North Wales, managed to get down to London before her. see that it's indefensible and what they're up against, and withdraw. She destroys London. The Roman army then presumably withdraws by Verulamium, St. Albans. Boudica comes up behind them and destroys Verulamium. We're then told that the Romans then break off, delay, and fight a battle. And I find it quite interesting that Tacitus gives us a very detailed step-by-step journey across the country. Colchester, London, St. Albans. He has the Romans coming down from Anglesey to London and then withdrawing. And I think if that battlefield was any great distance from St. Albans, we would have been given a bit more detail about they then headed north, or they then went west, or they did whatever, or another place would be mentioned. He doesn't. He gets them to St. Albans, and then he says they break off, delay, and fight a battle. He also describes the battlefield for us, the topography of it. It's not that useful in terms of the British landscape, because he describes a hill, not necessarily a hilltop. He doesn't say a hilltop. He says that the Roman position is backed by woodland, so they can't be outflanked from behind, and that the Britons approach them through some sort of narrowing landscape feature. We normally assume in some sort of shallow valley or something that constricts their approach, and that they're coming from clear ground. Open an ordnance survey map. There are dozens of these things. So people normally prospect for this battlefield by looking for places that vaguely match that description, and goodness knows some candidates don't even really look like that. But I think we need to be looking for this near Verulamium, and slowly going outwards from Verulamium to find firstly a landscape that fits, but also some evidence in the ground that this thing happened there. I'm an archaeologist, so I have to be evidence-led. I can't just go into the landscape and say, well, this landscape vaguely matches Tacitus. Let's see if we can get the evidence to come to this place. I followed the evidence, and to me, everything headed towards Verulamium. Lo and behold, when you get to Verulamium, there is a piece of topography. It's on the hills just to the southwest, about a mile away from Verulamium, where you have an ancient woodland on this massive, lovely, wide open plateau where the Roman army could have assembled. And you have a narrow, shallow valley heading down towards Watling Street, the road that Boudicca's army would be coming up from London. That in itself is interesting, and it really ticks all the boxes of what we're looking for. But crucially, at the top of that battlefield, exactly where you would have the Roman army arrayed, blocking the exit onto the high ground, you have dozens and dozens of slingshots, Roman-led slingshots. Now, they're a few centimeters long. They look like little rugby balls. They're made of lead. They weigh about 40 or 50 grams. And these were carried by the Roman auxilia. They were a devastating weapon. When they loosed them, a sling basically is a bit like a leather belt. You hang the sling bullet in the bottom, flick it around your head and loose it, and it goes off with the power of a pistol shot. They've got a range of 200 or 300 yards, and they are absolutely deadly things. Over 100 of these have been found up there, and although initially it wasn't thought that these were proof of a battle, perhaps they were hordes of lead buried for reuse that have been scattered by the plough. They've been reevaluated by Roman military historians now, and we're pretty confident it's a battle site. So when you bring all of that together, you have a landscape where you know Boudicca's army is. She destroyed the town a mile away. We know that she's there. We have the topography of this landscape that matches Tacitus exactly. And exactly where you would expect to find Roman battle artifacts, they're there in the soil, of the right date, probably 1st century AD. So really, in ancient battlefield hunting terms, it's quite a smoking gun, really.
And why do you think so many people are fascinated by this battle and by finding this battlefield, like yourself? Like, why are so many people so intrigued by this final moment final army moment for Boudica? We can talk about Boudicca's final moments in a second, but why do you think so many people are drawn to this?
I think it's the mystery aspect of it, the fact that it is a lost battlefield. It's the bloodiest, most apocalyptic, cataclysmic battle that ever took place on British soil. It was one of the great turning points, because obviously Boudicca lost the battle. Had she won, what would have happened? It's a fascinating question, and it all centers on this piece of ground. Tacitus claims that 80,000 Britons were killed on that battlefield. Now, that may be a gross exaggeration, but even if we halve it, it must have been tens of thousands. It probably was the single bloodiest day in British history. And the fact that Tacitus doesn't specifically say, and it was a mile outside Verulamium, on those hills just to the southwest, it leaves open that great question. So people have looked for it everywhere. It's often called the Battle of Watling Street. We don't know that it took place along Watling Street. My candidate just happens to be a mile away from Watling Street, and a lot of the others are as well. But people have placed it 75 miles to the north in Warwickshire, 65 miles west in Wiltshire, 40 miles east in Cambridgeshire. People have looked for it everywhere. And I think that's part of the problem. None of those landscapes have Boudica in them historically. You have to come up with a reason for her to go to these places, and none of them have any battle artifacts. So, as I say, as an evidence-led candidate, I think it's quite compelling.
So what happens to Boudica then?
We don't know, except that she doesn't survive, according to the Romans. So we have more than one account of what happens. So Tacitus goes for the suicide option. She took poison, according to Tacitus. Whether that's a little bit of a literary device and it is just the act of suicide he's describing rather than poison itself, we don't know. Dios says that she died of illness. Whatever that means and how long after, we don't know. Both of these could have happened on the battle. Well, certainly she could have committed suicide on the battlefield. It could have happened after. For Dio, for her to die of illness does suggest an escape from the battlefield. I would suggest that the Romans didn't know what happened to her. If she was on the final battlefield, and we assume she was, it's difficult to believe she got off of it alive. Tacitus says that every single living thing on the field was killed, even down to the baggage animals and the women and non-combatants. There would have been fugitives, but it's difficult to believe that Boudica could have gotten away and escaped long term without the Romans tracking her down. And the fact that the two sources we have give completely different ways of her dying, I would suggest means that they didn't really know. They assumed that she was dead on the field, and that was very probably the case, looking at the history.
Can we talk a bit about Boudicas' legacy? Because that is really what has ignited, at least I think, people to be so interested in her. Is just sort of throughout generation after generation, people seem to be fascinated by her all the time. And when you spoke to Tristan Hughes for the Ancients podcast, that's the one it's called, you said to him that Boudica's story is one of the greatest in British history, which is one of the reasons why probably her legacy has also continued. Is that because of this big battle and the question of what would have happened if Boudicca had won? Like, is that the backing for that? Or is it just, in general, Boudica's story of this woman uprising and the rebellion and all of this is also just epic? Like, it kind of sounds like a movie in a sense.
I think it is epic. And of course, she was lost to Britain for a very long time. Of course, for I suppose the better part of 1,000 years, we lost Boudica. She was rediscovered with the Renaissance and the rediscovery of these amazing Roman texts. And suddenly, she's one of the most remarkable characters. As I say, we don't actually know that much about Roman Britain historically. And in those histories, Boudica is this remarkable character. And especially when you go back to when she was really becoming first popular in British culture, of course, a lot of that took place during the Elizabethan period. So they had their own great warrior queen, giving her own battle speech at Tilbury before the Spanish Armada and things. So I think that connection was immediately made, that you had this incredible warrior woman from British history as this sort of to set the precedence for this. What I think really captures people about Boudica, she's very inspirational. It's very never say die. It's you can do what you want to us, but we are going to kick back and we are not going to give in. It is that sort of idea of kicking back and fighting back against something that's terrible. all the way through to the Victorians. And of course, she was troublesome for the Victorians because by that time, Britain was the great empire in the world. And Boudica was a native rebel who was fighting back against imperial domination. So she was very troublesome for the Victorians. The Victorians dealt with that by turning her into an imperial icon, rather perversely, and making her almost a prophesier of British greatness once the Romans had gone. One of the great things about Boudica for successive generations, I think, is that she's clearly this inspirational figure. You have this remarkable story of her, but we don't know much about her. The history doesn't tell us anything about Boudica. She existed. She had 2 daughters. She was married to Prasutagus until he died, and she led this ferocious rebellion. You get a few details from Dio about this, what she looked like with the red hair and the harsh voice, and it's made up. It's not a real description of Boudica. He's nicked that from other descriptions of barbarians and slightly feminized it. But because we know so little about Boudica, you can make her anything you want to be. And I think that's the glory of it. And that's what every generation does. Boudica becomes either the hero or villain, depending on the generation, I suppose, that they want and that they need. So once you have the Victorians with their amazing statue of her on the Thames by Thomas Thornycroft, that immediately becomes the focus for the suffragettes as a rallying point. This amazing warrior woman, this powerful warlike queen facing the Houses of Parliament. When you see her on Westminster Bridge, she's facing Big Ben. She's about to charge the Houses of Parliament, this seat of predominantly, certainly then, male power. So I think that's part of the enduring appeal of Boudica. It's a remarkable story. She's one of the few women from that era in British history that we know of, and my goodness, what a story behind it. She very, very nearly kicked the Romans back out.
Absolutely. Like, I couldn't agree with that more. Like, and I think, like, I didn't realize this when I was younger, but reading your book has really made me go, oh wow, this is really cool. It's one of those things that, especially now, Greek myth retellings are so popular and people are really bringing back these women that you're like, someone take Boudica, like someone write Boudica.
Yes, very, very much so. She's been particularly told in fiction. There's lots of great fictional works out there, and she's been covered by history and archaeology. But I always just felt that there was something more to find, and to actually. And that's part of the thing with my book and the project that I worked on for 3 years to do the book, was actually connecting with it on a human level. It's very easy to skip through it at school and say, the Britons were beaten, Boudica was flogged, and then you move on to the next subject. And I think as archaeologists, you actually very rarely get to dig on things as exciting as Boudican destruction deposits, especially if you're not in London or Colchester. But I think to really understand Boudica's rebellion, it's an emotive story. It's a very violent story, and I think to connect with it, or at least I found to connect with it, I needed to go out into the landscape and try and look at that landscape through her eyes and through the other participants' eyes, to go to landscapes that she would have known. And that archaeologically, because we know that certain parts of this landscape were occupied during her time, that they're landscapes she must have known. They are sites she must have been to. And now they're often quite not terribly interesting landscapes. As I say, one of the sites I described that Boudica and Prasutagus must have known is an industrial estate now. I'm at Thetford in Norfolk. Thetford's still a great landscape, but that is just an industrial estate. It's not a terribly exciting landscape. But Boudica and Prasutagus knew that place. They must have gone there, probably on quite a regular basis, perhaps for affairs of state, perhaps for rituals, whatever. And so to stand and to just look around and to try and think, actually, that's the same horizon that Boudica saw. This is the same. She knew this valley, and to try and connect with it on that level is quite remarkable. It's a wonderful thing to do.
Keeping on that idea of walking the landscapes and everything, my dad used to be a lawyer, and he always says that when you go to a scene, it changes regardless of whatever story you've been told as a lawyer. You have to go to the scene, you've got to go and see what happened there, burglary or whatever it happens to be, maybe worse. And now we'll always solidify, okay, this is actually the story that definitely happened, because what you're describing doesn't make any sense. Here it is. So did that happen with you? Like, did you have any assumptions going on, these walks and going to find these landscapes that then seeing them shifted?
Brilliant. Yeah, that's a brilliant question. I love that analogy very, very much so. Yeah. As I said, I've been interested in Boudica all my life. I've read all the literature, I've read the Romans, I've read the archaeology. So it's a subject I felt I knew incredibly well and very, very intimately, and there wasn't much that I could now learn about it. So when I thought what I'm going to do is travel the whole country, try and keep in the footprints of these people as much as humanly possible, I thought it would be a fairly matter-of-fact thing to do, and I hope there would be some insights. But you're absolutely right. When you actually go to these places, it all changes. Even if you're just going to visit an archaeological site that you've read about, which is no longer there, but it's just farmland again, or it's now been built over. I think it's nothing esoteric or ghostly or anything, but just places important. I think to an archaeologist particularly, I try to get across in the book that the sense of time passing is an illusion almost. It's the place that's important. It doesn't matter if something happened yesterday or 2,000 years ago at that place and you weren't there. They are both just as irretrievably lost to you. They're both in the past, they've gone. So the sense of distance is an illusion. It's the place. And if you for instance, I talk about a place called Snettisham now. Snettisham in North Norfolk is where this remarkable hoard of gold, talks and coins and all sorts of things were found. I knew the story of Snettisham and I'd read about it many times and I'd seen the pictures. I've been to see the talks in Norwich Castle Museum and the British Museum. But going to Snettisham and actually walking the landscape and trying to get a sense of it just completely opened my eyes to how this could be a ritual landscape, why it was important, what it meant to the people who impregnated it with these huge offerings of gold and silver and why it might be important. And you can't get a sense of that by sitting in a library. It is very much a case you have to go out and see these sites. They are, I describe it in the book, actually, I say they're indelible presences in the landscape. They might be gone, but even in London, where you might think it would be utterly impossible to connect with these events, yeah, the ground surface is 5, 6, 7 meters higher now, and just it's concrete and tarmac as far as the eye can see. But you can, by looking at the archaeology, identify particular places where you can go down to the level of the archaeology, be it a tube station, be it down into the basement of a shop, and stand exactly at the same level that these people were at. You're walking among their shadows, if you like, for want of a better term. And if you know the archaeology, you can actually visualize what's there. So, for instance, on Borough High Street in Southwark, in London, there's the ticket hall of London Bridge Tube Station, which was made in the early 1990s. And they excavated a row of houses there that were obliterated by Boudica, burnt to the ground. If I've been down there, and you can take the archaeological plan down with you and stand there, and the row of shops literally went down the length of the ticket hall. So as you walk through it to go through the gates to go down to the tubes below, you're walking through these houses that were destroyed by Boudica, and it's those points of connection. Yeah, it's absolutely vital. You can't understand it without doing that, I don't think. It's all about that human connection.
Is that also the advice that you would give to another maybe budding archaeologist or somebody who's really always been interested in archaeology and wants to study it and is watching this video, wanting to hear from you? Is the advice that you would give to them as well to go and make sure that you're also constantly walking and experiencing the sites that you're studying, if you obviously have the means to? Or would you have some other advice for a budding archaeologist of how to go about being and embodying the archaeologist that they always wanted to be?
I tend to immerse myself in subjects. So when I'm interested in something, I'm very myopic. I just focus on that, and that's it. I eat, breathe, drink, sleep, live that subject. So that's very much what I did with Boudica for 3 or 4 years. And so to me, that's all naturally a part of it. I have been interested in events that have taken place on the other side of the world that I've never visited. But even though you can watch videos of other people going there and you can read all the books, No, I don't think you can ever appreciate, really nail it without going there and walking the same landscape. I suppose it's a whole idea behind pilgrimage, isn't it? But I've another interest of mine is the First World War, which I touch on very briefly at the beginning of the book, particularly with going to the Somme, the part of the battlefield of the Somme. And in there, I actually take a portable DVD player and the film footage that was filmed on the opening day of the battle. And you can stand in the footprints of the guy with his big camera, big tripod camera that he would have been filming away. You can stand there now in his footprints and line up the screen horizon with the real horizon and actually watch what he filmed. And that sense of landscape and that sense of connection over that distance of time, however it is. And as I say, I think the distance aspect of time is irrelevant. It's a bit of a red herring, really. It's the place that's important. Yeah, definitely always try and get out to places, as many field trips as possible. There's a huge place for book work and research, and it's a great joy. I absolutely love library research. And you really need to know the classical texts, or if in another period you need to read the diaries, the memoirs, the accounts of people who are there, but take that out into the landscape. Try and walk in their footsteps and then read what they're saying. If you can stand on the southern shore of the Menai Strait and read Tacitus's account of the warriors and the druids and the priestesses with disheveled hair, waving firebrands at the Roman troops crossing the strait. You stand there and read that. That means a lot more than it does if you're sitting just at home reading it in your armchair. Very much so.
So normally I would end on the advice. Like the end of the episode is normally because I want people to walk away with a piece of advice. But I had a bonus question written down, and I told myself I'd only ask this if we had enough time, and we have enough time. So the question might sound stupid, but it was probably the most interesting part of the book to me. And it was the discussion of the name Boudica, and how actually that is really hotly contested, and how there's a lot of like backstory to it and spelling to it and where it came from and what it means. So again, this wasn't going to be a major part of the episode, but because we have time, could you explain a little bit about Boudica's name?
Traditionally, we call her Boadicea, and when I was at school in the 70s, it was still Boadicea. So my little drawing has Boadicea all over it. So Boadicea was actually a Renaissance spelling mistake. So the earliest copy of Tacitus to be found spelt her name Boudica, but with two C's. So Boudicca. A scribe, and when you see these original manuscripts, you can realize it's a very easy thing to do. They're quite a confusing read. A scribe has copied the U as an A and the second C as an E. So instead of Boudica, you have Boadicea or Boadicea. Boadicea, the spelling's just stuck traditionally for hundreds of years. So as I say, in the early period, she was all sorts of things. I think in Dio, it's closer to something like Boudica. But throughout most of British history, she's been known as Boudica for several hundred years. By the time the statue went up on the Thames in 1902, that calls her Boadicea, but underneath in brackets it says Boudica with two C's. So they were starting to use that by then, but into my lifetime it was still Boadicea. Celtic scholars have suggested that actually a better rendition, a more accurate modern rendition, would be Boudica with one C. So that's the convention we tend to use now. But it's a real name. Boadicea doesn't mean anything. That's the first clue that it's not a real ancient British name. Whereas Boudica, it means basically victorious, Victoria, victory, something broadly equating to that. So of course for Queen Victoria and the Victorians, she was a great thing. Their name meant the same thing, and they were both these great queens. But yes, so I always use Boudica now with one C. A lot of people still use two C's because that's how Tacitus spelt it. That's the more, I suppose, accurate Roman spelling. Boadicea is very rarely used now, except by older people who can sometimes get quite cross when you say Boudica, and they say, no, it's Boadicea. It's like, yeah, I'm happy to use Boadicea. I'm actually happy to use all three, and I do in the book. Depends on what I'm talking about. If I'm talking about the Victorians, talking about her. I always say Boadicea, that's her traditional name. If I'm quoting Tacitus, it's Boudica with 2 C's. And if I'm just talking, it's Boudica with 1 C. So...
Okay, Duncan, now I really should be wrapping this up. So thank you so much for joining me today, for tuning in despite the time difference and a bit of the malarkey on my end. Thank you very, very much. I hugely appreciate it. And of course, thank you to everybody at home who has watched this episode and who has supported the channel thus far. Now, it goes without saying, as I said at the start of the video, that you can find all the links to Echolands, A Journey in Search of Boudicca, in the description below. So you guys can find that with ease. You can find the Amazon links and all of that down there. If we have convinced you throughout this chat to read Duncan's incredible book, and I cannot recommend it enough. So thank you guys so much for tuning in, and we'll be seeing you next time with more videos here on Moan Inc. So I'll see you guys then.